Welcome back to Acid Horizon. I'm Craig, and this week, Charles J. Stovall returns to discuss his new book, Unfolding the Deleuze Seminars, 1970 to 1987, out now on Edinburgh Press. Charles, along with our friend Dr. Bob Langan, is going to lead us on a long journey into the labyrinth of Deleuze's work inside the classroom, the packed rooms, the radical pedagogy, and the unique experience of thinking alongside Deleuze. This episode comes in two parts. The first is free and available right now wherever you're listening, and the second goes deep into the Spinoza seminars and is available exclusively on our Patreon. While you're there, check out our solidarity-based subscriptions to the AHRC course archive. At the time of this recording, there are still a few monthly spots left, so navigate to the relevant post on Patreon to find out more. All right, let's get into it. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the theory podcast. Today, it is our pleasure to be joined once again by Charles Stovall, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of French at Wayne State University, co-director of the Deleuze Seminars Archive at Purdue, translator of The Logic of Sense, or at least one of the translators, ABC d'Air, and most recently, On Painting. And he is also the author of Unfolding the Deleuze Seminars, 1970 to 1987, published last year by Edinburgh University Press, and that's the book that we're going to take a look at today. It's a remarkable book, part concordance, part guide, part act of devotion that distills more than 200 of Deleuze's seminar sessions into summaries and commentary, giving researchers and curious readers alike a map into the archive that has until now been vast, sprawling, and frankly, a little daunting to navigate online. We're also delighted to have back with us Dr. Bob Langan, who many of you know from his appearances on Left Hand, and who joined us during the Anti-Oedipus Files reading group, where we spent considerable time unpacking the fault lines between Freud and Jung and their complicated relationship to Deleuze and Guattari. Bob is the author of Jung and Spinoza, Passage Through the Blessed Self, published with Routledge, the first full-length study of Jung's curious and largely unacknowledged relationship with Spinoza's philosophy. So today, together, we want to engage with Charles' book, but we also want to inhabit the world of those Tuesday sessions, the packed rooms, the unique atmosphere, the unusual experience of a philosopher thinking out loud, demanding that his students understand, but that they also sense what he has to offer. To that end, we will be spending time with the Spinoza seminars of Deleuze, particularly Spinoza, The Velocities of Thought, both as a window into Deleuze's pedagogy and an anticipation of On Spinoza, Charles' forthcoming translation with the Deleuze Seminars Translation Collective, due from the University of Minnesota Press sometime soon. And I think this feels like the right place to begin. Charles, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Well, thanks for welcoming me.
Well, here's a place that I would like to start today. Let's start within the classroom of Gilles Deleuze. Based on your reading of the seminars, based upon your research, and for anyone who hasn't, for example, experienced a French university seminar of the era in which Deleuze was teaching, can you give us a picture of what that room would look like? Who were the kind of people that showed up? What was the atmosphere like walking in? Because it sounds like it was very much unlike anything that we have to offer in the Anglophone university tradition.
Sure. Well, you have to understand that as a result of the events of May 1968, the French government very quickly, even in May and June of 1968, were already trying to figure out a way to satisfy the criticism from the left and the leftist students in France about the sort of sclerotic experience they were having in the French university. And so they came up with this idea of putting together an experimental university that would be situated out on the east edge of Paris near the Vincennes Castle. And that's where Deleuze landed in 1970. And there are a number of different histories of this. But Deleuze started there, recruited by Foucault, who by the time Deleuze got there in fall 70, Foucault had already taken off to work at the Collège de France. But Deleuze started there. And so as an experimental university, the whole purpose was an attempt to bring in people from as many different perspectives as possible. And it soon became clear to the students, given Deleuze's personality in the classroom, extraordinarily welcoming and inclusive in terms of just listening to student comments, that his seminar was something that shouldn't be missed. So consequently, I have the cover of my book as one of these famous pictures of Deleuze's seminar. Deleuze is this little speck over here on the left-hand side of the picture, and there you got this sea of students. And the seminar rooms that they gave him were really, really cramped, but that was, if you will, Deleuze's fault, because Deleuze refused to be housed in any kind of the big amphitheaters where more plenary type courses would take place. Well, he didn't want to have a plenary course. He really wanted to have a seminar in the true sense of the term, which meant a lot of exchange with students, real proximity to the students, physical, and as also trying to engage them and get them to respond. And in the 70s, that is, in the era just following May 68, there was a lot of contestation and a lot of chaos that unfolded. And we don't have any recordings for the seminars until 1979, which was 79-80, which was the last year that courses were held at Vincennes. And the reason why it was the last year is because the physical plant, as it were, of the Vincennes Experimental University was deemed to be, over that decade, a hotbed for radicals, and as it was described by the right drug dealers and all kinds of other malfeasance. And so consequently, through the efforts of the conservative president, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, and his education secretary, they basically eliminated the university. And by the end of summer of 1980, that is a few weeks after Deleuze finished teaching in spring of 1980, they bulldozed the campus and moved the entire operation to a location to the north of Paris in Saint-Denis. So Deleuze, it had quite a following. And moving to Saint-Denis was not necessarily any kind of solution for the crowded classroom, because, again, he was assigned to these smallish rooms, and the rooms were packed. You can see online, we have a number of links, particularly in the seminar that we have labeled the Anti-Oedipus 1 on the Deleuze Seminars website. You can see the videos that were taken. These were filmed for RAI Italian television by one of Deleuze's students, Marielle Burkhalter. And so you can see the classroom, and the very first episode shows Deleuze trying to physically get into the classroom, get to his place, climbing over people, and people having to move themselves out of the way. If you look at any of the other videos that are available, you'll see the same thing. It was insane. And that's one of the remarkable paradoxes of Deleuze's teaching experience, that he was, on the one hand, really trying to experiment and use these classrooms as laboratories for the work that things that he was thinking about. And at the same time, he had to deal with some of the most inane daily stuff, like chasing after students to get them to sign these little forms that would allow them to get course credit. And, you have these moments where Deleuze is saying at the end of the the little green cards, Deleuze is screaming at the students, and you're thinking, you just shake your head. I try to mention, to the extent that it was possible, to mention these tiny little bits throughout the summaries and commentary in my book. Just when something struck me as completely anomalous, at least try to get a mention of that in there.
Well, it seems like some things never change. I mean, when I was teaching at the university and in high school settings too, doing very much of the same things. But speaking also of just my own graduate education in education, I often think that some of the ways in which we regard the classroom, whether it be a flipped classroom, the displacement of the sage on the stage, that maybe even a lot of those methodologies in some part have some determination from the kinds of experiments that were undertaken and implied within things like anti-Oedipus, like the way that we handle group organization or how we can rethink pedagogy outside of a hierarchical frame. That then leads me just to talk about Deleuze's own laboratory and his own methods. In the book, I think you mentioned that he said that his course entails as much emotion as intelligence. If there's no emotion, there's nothing. And he keeps using this little phrase, and I'm going to try to speak the French here, and I'll edit it out if it just doesn't work. This phrase, it's il faut que vous sentiez. You must sense this. And that might be an unusual demand to make of a philosophical audience, that one must sense the philosophy as well in the context of the classroom. How did students respond to that? And do you think it only fully makes sense in retrospect once you've lived with Deleuze's work for a while?
Well, I think I have to say yes on that last question. But yeah, I in all honesty, if you had 200 students in a room, you had 200 different ways of how they're going to try to process that. But that was really, truly one of his deeply felt approaches to communicating with the students, that trying to communicate this sense of not simply cognizing, but to bring it into almost an epidermal experience, because he really felt that there were questions of, and I'm going to use a term that may not seem to be congruous here, but taste. But he said it's a matter of philosophical taste and feeling. The taste and the feeling kind of go hand in hand. You might have a philosopher who convient ou ne vous convient pas, might suit you or might not suit you. And that suitability connects to that feeling and to that taste, the goût that you have in relationship to a particular philosopher. So a number of times he would handle objections precisely by using that, if you will, as a response or a ploy, however you want to look at it. There's a moment in one of the On the Lines of Life seminars that come at the end of the academic year 1980, where a student who much prefers Kierkegaard to Spinoza raises that as a point. And I said, and Deleuze said, well, okay, there's nothing wrong with liking Kierkegaard, although the Kierkegaard that I'm hearing from you is not the Kierkegaard that I really understand to be Kierkegaard. And he said, but it comes a point where we can follow along the path together, and then we have to go our separate ways. And he says, and as you go your way with Kierkegaard, do what you can not to mangle him. This comes back as in some ways, a leitmotif in many of the different lessons of one's taste and that sense of feeling for a philosopher or key points, that you might have it or you might not. And his attitude is, if what I'm saying to you doesn't work for you, well, there are other seminars that you can certainly go to here at Vincennes, and by all means, go sit in on one of them, try other thinkers and speakers, and see where you find the place that suits you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to jump too ahead to the Spinoza material, but how I have read these seminars myself is very germane to what you're talking about, and seems to be in the spirit of the three steps you give to reading the seminars in the preface of this book, which is you have an encounter, and maybe you have the speed to stay with that encounter, maybe you don't, but eventually you can link the concepts to other things. And within, whether it's me reading the Spinoza seminars or any of these seminars, or seeing the students reacting to Deleuze's teachings, it is almost, okay, are you going to go with me on this line? And if not, that's okay, you can do something else, or maybe they go back to it later. So it just really strikes me how nonlinear, if you will, the teaching method is here. It is sort of just saying, okay, are you going to go along with me on this concept or not? He does that a lot in the Spinoza seminars, and really all of them. And just it almost is more just Deleuze seeing if he can force an encounter with his students rather than trying to didactically teach something, which is very interesting to me.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to limit that to Spinoza's seminar, but yeah, he's working out. I mean, his approach is to find problems and find problems and to pose questions in relationship to those problems, and then to develop concepts that can help address those problems that he sees. And he really feels that, both in terms of, I believe, in terms of his teaching, but certainly in terms of writing, that any book worth its salt that you might write has to know what kind of problem that it's addressing, and then lay out the pathway to finding questions that'll help address those problems. And I think that those were the kinds of things that he was bringing up in each of the seminars, and he can see this, I think, really clearly in the successive 4 years of the cinema seminars, because in the first one, where it's really, if you will, a focus on the movement image, but developed a term that he develops, a concept that he develops based on reading Bergson. Bergson really takes the fore in throughout the book, much to Deleuze. It turns out Deleuze's chagrin, in the sense that he had hoped also to bring in Charles Sanders Peirce, and so hence the year 2, which is classifications of signs. Well, it's sort of flipped. Bergson's still around, but it's the Peircean. And in the meantime, Deleuze reworks pretty much everything that he had worked through in year 1. It's the first 10 chapters in both years of the movement image, Cinema 1 movement image. But at the end of year 2, he really makes a connection. Well, I guess so also at the end of year 1 to some extent, but certainly at the end of year 2, he knows he's got to move on now. And there he brings in many of the terms that will connect to the next part of the project, which is the time image. And then Cinema 3 and Cinema 4, he deals with separate problematics within the framework. And so you could say that Cinema 3 seminar deals with, say, the first 5 or 6 chapters of Cinema 2, the time image, and then the last half of Cinema 2, the time image, is encompassed in the 4th seminar, which is Cinema and Thought. You can see him teasing out the different aspects of each of these problems, and as he goes along, he tries to find ways to engage the students and bring students in. Specific students bring him different things. So there is a young man. Oh man, I'm blanking on his name, but his first name is Pascal. And he came up with the idea of, and Deleuze attributes it to him, of the any space whatsoever, l'espace quelconque. And this is a particular kind of image and a kind of spatial and also temporal fact, to find a simple word, in various kinds of cinema. And so much discussion gets generated with that student in the classroom, but also Deleuze developing in that terminology. Another student he finds I believe it's in Cinema 4, where he's dealing with the crystal image. And lo and behold, there's a guy sitting in the classroom who happens to know all about crystallography. And so Deleuze taps into this guy and listens to his spelling things out about how the crystal works. And so you have this particular intervention. And you'll see this again in Leibniz and the Baroque, the last seminar, with the whole concept of harmony, because harmony is a term that's specific within the within the Leibnizian perspective. And so he has some musicologists in the classroom who help him out, and particularly the final seminar of his teaching in June of 1987. But the various people pop up at different points, and so he calls on expertise when needed to try to bring in some perspectives. Eric Allier was one of his students, and Eric Allier helps and gives an intervention in the last 1,000 Plateaus seminar discussing issues of mercantilism. So it's a fascinating interplay that's going on here in terms of Deleuze developing the class as a laboratory, and at the same time trying to maintain some kind of forward momentum. Because one of the experiences I had was I wrote an essay for a book, the book that came out, I believe, in 2024, Deleuze and Time. And I wrote an essay on Deleuze as a man out of time, because of the kind of tensions that arose within the classroom and the space of the temporal space, and that he had to deal with in his interplay with the students, and how trying to make progress within the time frame he had allotted for each class, approximately 2 to 3 hours, depending. You'd see that there would be plenty, but things happen. And sometimes he gets off track, sometimes students get him off track. And so there was always a kind of a tension there with him trying to, I would say maintain control, but just walk that line of inclusion, but at the same time, him having his agenda and trying to work through the different steps of the problematic that he wants to address in the course of that academic year.
Well, speaking of Deleuze getting off track, I decided to add this question at the last minute, thinking you might be one of the most apt people to whom this could be asked, which is the Badiou episode as being this extraordinary piece of intellectual theater from this period, the Maoist brigades physically invading Deleuze's sessions. What do we know about these disruptions? What were they like? And beneath the sort of political theatrics, was there a genuine philosophical disagreement at stake?
I just looked in the index of my book just to see. I don't even reference Badiou. And that's not to say that what your question isn't pertinent. On the contrary, but it's not something Badiou that I know of. Badiou never makes an appearance in any of the seminars of the 216 sessions that I've had to deal with in writing this book. There's plenty of things that are left out. There's a whole year, 74, 75, where we have absolutely nothing. And not every speaker is identified, particularly in the recordings. Many of the interventions are by students I don't know. There are two moments in, again, referencing we call 1,000 Plateaus, one from 1975, 76. And you have on film, and you can see these debates that take place among the students with Deleuze present, in some ways participating, in some ways sitting back. There were two particular debates that took place over things that had nothing to do with philosophical import. One was about how crowded the classroom was and how intolerable it was to be forced to sit in the classroom. And this was this long debate that went on. It was like about a quarter of the class. And the solution was for the next class to remove all the tables, to push all the tables back against the wall so that the students at least could circulate, because these tables would create this blockage. And so that was a solution for that. But the other debate is one that's even more peculiar, which is apparently a student jumped up. It's not on film, but a student jumped up at one point and a woman addressed Deleuze and accused him of plagiarism or something of the sort in something that had been published. And basically the debate among the students is whether to throw her out or not. And if they had the authority, or this was something that was permissible within their floating frame of reference. And the irony of this is another discussion that went on for about 30 minutes, and lots of yelling, posturing, and so forth. And the irony was that at the end, when they finally came to the decision that, yes, we can throw her out, she'd already scampered. She'd already gotten out of the classroom. She wasn't sitting there for the whole debate listening to it. She was gone. But Deleuze is sitting throughout this with his coat and hat on, overcoat and his hat. And so it's peculiar, because when you're trying to piece these things together, particularly in this segment of this seminar, it seems like we're looking at a different day altogether. But in fact, when she made this accusation, he put his coat and hat on to leave. And the students were able to basically talk it out and walk him back from leaving the classroom. And then once that finished, then he went on and talked for another hour. So as for the specifics of Badiou, there are too many other things I got going on to keep my finger on the pulse of Badiou. And in general, he was somebody who, I would say, using a French term, an emmerdeur, shit stirrer upper. That was his thing. And in the framework of a Maoist perspective from the 70s, well, he was a member I believe, a member of the faculty at Vincennes. If you look back at some of the histories of the starting of Vincennes and foundation of Vincennes, he was there from the beginning. And in fact, advising Foucault, because Foucault's organization of the Department of Philosophy had to do a lot with pleasing the various political perspectives that wanted representation across the different leftist groups. And so Badiou had his finger on the scale, even in advising Foucault on hires, if you will. So he was around. Again, it's kind of astounding that he doesn't make an evident appearance in any of the material that I've had access to, unless I've been staring right at it and it's not there. But I have there are various people who are part of our collective who were there and know some of the names, they know some of the voices, and so they've been able to identify them. I'm sure if he had been a part of of any of the recordings, somebody would have pointed it out to me.
Yeah, this is slightly off topic, but just somewhat germane to the use of your text. I think I'm probably a successful case study for the need of a text like the one that you put out on Unfolding Seminars, because I had gotten through Deleuze through Spinoza again, but then I eventually stumbled upon Web Deleuze and other places online where you could find the seminars. I think there was a blog spot that had them as well, but Web Deleuze was the main place. This is like 10, 12 years ago now when I was still in school. But it's great to immerse yourself in them and to chase them. But one of the big problems with doing that is, for instance, if I come back and I say, okay, where was this discussion on the principle of sufficient reason in the Leibniz seminars, let's say, and there's a specific phrase, I'm looking for it. Well, even on the Purdue website, which is magnificent, if I search for just affection, let's say in that case, you're going to come up with a lot of hits on that. Like, that's not too useful. So to have a text that sort of just gives you a distillation of all these seminars, and that way you can kind of recall where in a chain of an argument something was, which is, at least for me, a best way to remember it. It's a very, very valuable resource. And again, to just go back and forth between certain things that, oh yes, he says this in this Leibniz seminar, or maybe he says this in one of the 1,000 Plateau seminars. That's a really good use for the book. And is that how you envision people using it? Is that like a successful case in that instance, where you almost use it as like if not a compass, a map or something that's side by side with the actual seminars themselves?
Yeah, that definitely. So as I was trying to go through the creating the different summaries, the summaries stemmed from the structure that was made for us. Dan Smith hired a firm to create the framework for our website and how each of the web pages, seminar pages the session pages would look. And that included a pull quote at the top, and then a space for summary underneath the pull quote and the title of the particular seminar and session. So somebody had to write these. And so guess who? I wrote them all. And that's 216 or so. And it occurred to me then that these would be really useful if making sure that they provided enough information that a reader who came to this say, oh, wow, okay, that term is discussed, but without having to go the extra mile of fleshing out any of the case studies or examples, maybe indicating what they are. And so gradually I realized that full-on summaries would really be useful for a reader as a companion to working with the site. I ended up having to rewrite all 216 summaries for the site so that I wasn't simply reduplicating them in my book. So they're distinct. The ones on the site are much more compressed, if you will, than what we have in the book. The book is much more fleshed out. And also the question of not just key terms, which that's what the index is, I hope is very, very useful for, but also key names and how those names connect to certain key terms. One of the features in each of the sessions, in all the sessions except for one, I believe, at the end or two, at the end of the particular summary, you'll have additional key names. Those additional key names were ones that, for whatever reason, I didn't cite in the summary, but nonetheless feature within at another point, or maybe to a lesser degree, but nonetheless are within that particular session. So that, and I didn't put those additional key names in the index, but anybody using the book can certainly flip through and see where various names pop up. And if needs be, if you don't see your favorite Beckett quote, just go to the website and plug in the word Beckett, and Samuel Beckett is going to pop up all over the place. And God forbid you put in the name Foucault, because that's going to blast you out of your chair.
One of the things about the seminar formats that I really appreciate, well, there's a few things I might have mentioned on the show before that probably my favorite way to have a philosophical encounter on the page is through a transcribed philosophical interview. And maybe second to that, it's the seminar format, at least in the way that we encounter it in Deleuze's case. It seems much more conversational. Also, I will say that the seminars for me have been more informative and more in-depth in some cases than the primary texts, namely on a topic that we already brought up, the crystal image and the time image. Like you're saying, that interaction with the student who knew about crystals in particular was helpful. Not to mention, I think it's in the seminars that we learn that Guattari was actually the primary influence, or at least he named the crystal image as the concept, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm curious for you, since you spent so much time with these seminars, for me, it's kind of voyeuristic. There's like a time travel sort of quality to overhearing these conversations. Is that something that you feel when going through the transcripts and translating them? And is there something that you think survives in those transcripts that we really don't get in primary text, like Anti-Oedipus, for example, or the cinema books?
It's a phenomenon in Deleuze's own becoming, as it were, as a writer, that he mentions this on a number of different occasions. If you were to plug in the word sobriety, the term sobriety for him has a particular resonance, not so much to do with any kind of consumption, but with, if you will, production, in the sense that he describes, for example, the Kerouac's writing, or just take Kerouac as having greater and greater sobriety as he continues to develop his writing. And the sobriety, in his sense, he uses the image of the Japanese line drawing, where it's just a fine line that from which you glean so much from so little. And it seems like Deleuze was tending towards that more and more as he moved forward in his career. I think the cinema books in particular reveal that. If I use the expression freeze-dried Deleuze. If you pour a little water on the seminar, on the book, you get the seminars. And the seminars expand out and give you much more per concept than you might have expected. But this happens even more so. I mean, come on, Foucault. The Foucault seminar, the last two sessions, 25 and 26, are really Q&A and summary discussions of different things. So if you take the first 24 sessions and follow the organization of the Foucault book pretty rigorously, that's 24 times 2 hours. That's 48 hours at least of discussion. And in some cases, they go on for 3 hours. A lot of expansion happens there in terms of the various concepts that he's dealing with in his greater intensity and sobriety in the Foucault book. And then Leibniz and the Baroque, forget it. The seminars are almost, the Leibniz and the Baroque seminar is almost absolute necessity to clarify each of the chapters of Leibniz and the Baroque, because he really expands out particularly the first three chapters as you're trying to get a sense of what he's getting at in terms of the Baroque in relationship to the different concepts he's raising. It's just astounding. Dan Smith has talked about this, and he's written about this, about the phenomenon of talking about Plotinus in the seminar, and Plotinus has no place, or maybe one short tiny little paragraph in Leibniz and the Baroque. And my example is Mallarmé. I mean, Mallarmé, in terms of the fold, is one of Deleuze's key reference. He spends I think it's the first session in February of 87, he devotes a good quarter, if not half of the session to Mallarmé, and Mallarmé pops up elsewhere. But when you go into the Leibniz and the Baroque, it's Mallarmé, but don't blink, because the importance of the terms that he's using in relationship to Mallarmé, okay, you can sort of sense it. But once you looked at the seminar and heard Deleuze talking about this, then you realize there's so much more that he's hinting at. So what you're describing is this movement within Deleuze's writing and the importance of style and composition for him in creating his own kinds of line drawing, using what that really is one of his favorite reference. And he sees himself doing very much the same thing.
Yeah, it reminds me somewhere in the Spinoza sessions, I believe it's when they're talking about one of the instances where they're talking about the third kind of knowledge and essence and the experience of essence. Deleuze said something along the lines of Spinoza doesn't totally explain this in book 5 of the Ethics, which is where he primarily deals with that third kind of knowledge. But a great author leaves things unsaid, is what Deleuze says. And that's very germane to this, where within the text, especially expressionism and philosophy, and Deleuze does go yard on some of the really out there ways he interprets Spinoza, and perhaps Spinoza was indeed saying the same things as well. But it does, in terms of the experience of essence, what happens when you die. He explains some things, but it is somewhat compacted. Whereas in the seminars, I mean, there's like 3 sessions towards the end about getting to that third kind of knowledge. And again, it's almost like he's almost trying to, okay, the students are going to go with me on this line, so we'll go back and we'll stay at the second level, and then we'll try again. And he does that, and he has a great discussion of that with Richard Pinhas. Hopefully I've said that correctly. About Pinhas has an analogy of it in terms of musical composition, where he says, okay, well, maybe the instruments are sort of the parts being used. The logic of relations is the song, that second level of knowledge. And then the third kind is his power being expressed. And it's kind of working for Pinhas, but he's not quite going with it, even though Claire Parnay and Deleuze are both saying, no, that's it, you're getting it. But it's almost like he's trying to drag the students to that third point. But the seminars are where that's all explicated, whereas in the books, it's a bit more sometimes left just implicated instead.
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. That's a great example. And the whole question of death and Spinoza's take on death, I mean, it's spelled out there much quite clearly, and it's fascinating. I don't think you see the same kind of engagement with that in expressionism philosophy or in the Spinoza practical philosophy. And the previous year, at the end of the event, the one that's been translated, that I'm translating as Lines of Life, those last 2 sessions of 1980. Deleuze is very, very forceful about speaking about lines of death and speaking against the whole concept of lines of death because of its relationship to fascism. And so his equating the lines of death with fascism and the way that fascism itself extols death as a goal for itself. So it's interesting to see, because one of the students, I think, in the Spinoza seminar that addresses a specific question to Deleuze about Spinoza and death, and he's quite forthright about it. Obviously, not speaking of it the way he had the previous year, but death is from the outside, and so this is something that you're working towards movement, towards beatitude, moving across into this third level. And through the cultivation of joyful passions and the avoidance of the sad passions, and as much as one can on a daily basis. But the whole aspect of death is something that comes upon one, but it's always from the outside. And it's so interesting in the Spinoza seminar how much time he takes to talk about illness and the different kinds of illness, and really from a fascinating perspective. You think that this was in the era early in the AIDS crisis, and so he's talking about immunodeficient types of diseases already in 1981. And I mean, it's for me, it just is. It's kind of an amazing moment in that seminar where he's bringing in this in relationship to composition and decomposition of relations.
I was just going back through the Spinoza velocities of thought, and just reading Deleuze's Spinoza made me think how difficult it is to be a Spinozist at the level of fending off one's own sad passions. You know, I'm a little bit of a reward seeker sometime, I have to admit, and he flags that. But I think what we'll do actually at this point is I have like one more big question about your book, and then I'm going to kind of turn it to Bob, and maybe he'll lead us on the discussion about Spinoza. And what I'll probably do is make that part of the discussion available to our patrons only, those people who have continued to support. Speaking of rewards and sad passions, thank you for supporting us, and we will let you hear that portion of the conversation. But just to finish up on your book here, I described it as summaries of the seminar. It can be used as a concordance, but clearly it can do much more than that. It seems to be something that has been created for the purpose of the Deleuze researchers of now and for the future. Is that what you tried to do with unfolding the seminars?
Definitely. I see this as a legacy project. And also to at least allude to, if not actually write it on the unwritten history of Deleuze's teaching. I mean, this provides at least the summary aspects of that unwritten history, and someone else who might have been there, I don't know if that's ever going to occur, but nonetheless might write something from a completely different perspective. But that's why I sort of situate the summaries between an intro that provides questions about coming to Vincennes. Deleuze is coming to Vincennes in that juncture between his teaching for 4 years at the University of Lyon, then his illness at the same time as he's defending his thesis and as doctorat d'état, and then basically sort of floating between trying to find a new institution that would hire him for when he came back to health. And the irony is, if you think about this, the crazy thing about this is that this was exactly at the same time that he encountered Félix Guattari and started that collaboration. It all came together in 1969. What a 1969 Deleuze had, and moved into 1971. He started at the fall of 1970 at Vincennes. And then I close it with trying to see how these seminars connect to some of the other works that follow, not going into huge detail about those, but just trying to make connections between things we've seen that are present in the seminar and certainly the Control Society essay, which is how do you say the germs of that, the seeds of that in the Foucault seminar, the Abécédaire, which itself is, if you will, you see a number of ways in which the Abécédaire is announced, or topics are announced in the seminars, and then also what is philosophy, because what in philosophy is a backdrop to Deleuze for at least a decade of his teaching, if not more. But certainly in 1979, 1980, he mentions this in his 5 sessions Leibniz seminar. So yeah, the idea that people can come to this from a number of different perspectives and use it as a compendium and use it as a concordance, use it as a reference, and then to jump off into Cyberland and to pull things down. We're hoping to get all the seminars available in some kind of accessible PDF fashion. And again, this is all open access. No, we're not, it has institutional support, Purdue, fortunately, and we're almost done with we have 8 translations to go. Unfortunately, our financial support from NEH, for some reasons that should be more than obvious, has dried up. And we have yet another application. And the fortunate thing is that our program still exists. So the program under which we got the previous NEH grants still exists. And so they're still accepting applications. And so there's still a possibility. And it all boils down to seeing if you can, on the one hand, write an application that doesn't trigger any little tripwires that would just get it thrown out automatically, and then getting a committee who would review it with some kind of positivity. Ironically, we did succeed this last time, and because of changes to the budgetary structure, basically summarily they had to throw out grants that were granted and given positive green light. They had to throw them out, and we were one of them. So it's such a crapshoot at this point, but that's okay. It still gives us, having 8 left still gives us grounds to apply for another one. So, I could get these done by the end of the spring if we really wanted to finish the site. It's just, maybe it's good to be incomplete at this point strategically.
It's just sad. The humanities are being attacked on so many fronts, and all that money that could be used to translate the seminars are now being repurposed for imperialist ventures. But you should all, by unfolding the Deleuze Seminars 1970 to 1987, Summaries and Commentary by Charles J. Stovall from Edinburgh Press. And we're really happy to support this project in the modest way in which we can do so. And at this time, as I said, we will turn our discussion to Deleuze and Spinoza. And if you'd like to receive that discussion, just go ahead and subscribe to us on Patreon.